So we can just keep adding things to here. Next thing, new item, and we'll just keep adding them here. One thing I noticed though is this is adding to the end, and I feel like whenever I'm using a to-do app, I like for them to, the newest things to pop up at the top. You might be different, but I'm going to show you how you can do that really easily. So you see here we're spreading in the to-dos and then putting the to-do after. It's a simple fix of just rearranging the order. So we'll put that to-do in first, refresh, and try it now. See? So we're putting it at the top. I feel like that looks a little better. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but at least now you know how you can very easily change that order up. So we'll move right along. Next thing we want to do is we want to be able to delete one of these to-dos. So we got to do a couple things to be able to do that. Number one is, well, just from a UI standpoint, let's actually create a button. Let's just put an X, right? And we'll have an on click. We don't know what it's going to be yet, but we want to do something when we click on this button, and that thing is obviously to remove that to do from the list. But how do we do that? You know, there's more than one way, but the way that we're going to do that here is we'll actually use the array filter method. And you see here the filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the tests implemented by the provided function. So basically we want to filter out this particular to-do when we click on it and create this new array that we now save and replace the state with that. Okay, so let's define a delete handler here. This doesn't exist yet. We can follow our same pattern here, clean this up a little bit. So we have our to-do that we're importing and then our receiving, and then we have our delete handler. Okay, so that prop is ready to go. Let's move up to our index file and actually define the delete handler. Within here is where we're going to do our filter method. But before that, let's make a little note for ourselves so when we come back we'll know where we're at. What we want to do now is actually pass this delete handler function down to our to-do component. So not only can you pass through just like strings and arrays and stuff, you can also pass functions as props. So come to the to-do list, and so this right now is an example of what we call prop drilling. Prop drilling is effectively when a component actually, you can see in this case, this component has nothing to do with the delete handler. It doesn't use it anywhere. It doesn't interact with this at all other than just passing it along to its children. See, like this is receiving it and immediately just passing it along. That's prop drilling. You can see how this can get very crazy very quickly if you have a large or even just a normal size application where you need to pass things down from a high parent to a child, 6 levels deep or 8 or 10 or 12 levels deep. You have to pass it along to each component down the line, and it can be a huge pain to do that, and there's methods and ways to handle that a little more effectively than just straight out of the box like this, using like Redux and the context API and stuff. But We're not going to get into that. This is a pretty small, straightforward application. We're only going one level, so we'll just continue with this as is. So now we want to go back and actually define our method for filtering out the to-do that we're clicking on, right? So let's define a variable, const new to-dos, okay, equals to-do list dot filter. Okay, so for each item, we want to perform this callback function on that item. This is where we define our test. Okay, so if the item dot ID, we essentially want to keep every item that doesn't have the same ID as the item that we're clicking on. So it's not equal to the ID. Now the ID is not defined at this point. This is the ID that we will send along when we call this function. So we want to also return this, and we're good to go there. The only thing we need to do now is update our state. So set to-do list to new to-dos. We'll save, and then let's go back to our to-do. Now we need to modify the way this is being called a little bit so we can actually pass that ID up. Okay, so we have in here, this is a function, but we can also run this as a callback. And that way we're able to add a little bit more data in there, a little bit more functionality, a little bit more control. So our delete handler, remember it's going to accept that ID, right? So we want to say to-do.id. So we'll save and let's go try it out. Click our X and see it goes away. New item. Another item. Okay. There we go. We can now delete our items.
So the last thing we need to do to finish up our CRUD functionality is actually our edit function. And edit functions are, out of all of them, the most difficult, at least on the client side. So just like before, we want to put our edit function up here on the same level with the delete function. So let's do that. We'll say const, it's going to be update, right? Update handler equals, and we'll just, for now, make this a callback function, and update logic goes here. Now we want the proper component to have access to this. So let's look here. We're going to want to be able to edit one of these, right? Logic would follow that we would need to have this function available to each one of these individually, right? So to do that, let's copy this, make this quick, and pass that down. Okay, we're going to go to the actual to-do list, and this is when we will drill this prop down. And finally, to do. Okay, so now we've got our function down to where we need it, and we're going to need to do a couple of things. The first thing is we want to be able to, whenever we double click on the actual message, we want to convert into an input where we can actually edit that message. So we're going to need some state for that. We're going to need some state for whether the editing is on or not. And we're going to need a second set of state to actually hold that input data within this component. So then we can send it back up in our update handler to do something with it later on. Okay, so those are the two things we need to do in this component specifically. So the first thing we'll do here is we will import use state, because we know we're going to need some state. And we'll say, we'll declare is editing set is editing. Okay, so this is our edit state. And we'll set it initially to false. And then our second state is going to be, let's call this updated to do, set updated to do. Okay, so with this one, we can actually save our form input in state. So we're going to need a couple of functions. First one is, let's call this update to do, if I can spell, state. Update the state with the value entered in the input. The second function we're going to need is, we're actually going to need to do two things in this function. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. Whenever we actually submit our form, there's two things we want to do. Number one is we want to actually submit that value through our update handler so we can then do something with it at our application level. But also we want to clear out the form. Okay, so we want to reset the form. So let's call this update and reset. So this will receive the input and the event. So, you know, when we submit, of course, remember we want to prevent the default so we don't get a re-render or a refresh whenever we submit this. And we know that we're going to need to set is editing back to false. This is when we call the update handler with the input. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, exactly the way it sounds. Update handler input. And to keep this all consistent, since I'm not using the semicolons, let's take that out. We can leave that here. And in here, in our update to do state function, let's set the updated to do to what? Well, a to do consists of an ID and a message, right? Remember, we have an ID and a message, ID message, okay? So we don't want to change the ID, right? We want to keep the ID the same. If we go and change the ID, then it's going to screw a lot of stuff up. So let's keep the ID the same. So let's say ID, let's declare that as the to-do that we get from props.id. Okay, so it remains the same there, no problem. And the message is what we do want to change, right? So we want to get, remember we want to get that, what we'll need to do is pass through the event parameter and save this as e.target.value. Okay, same thing that we did in the to-do form. And the last thing we want to do is we actually want to conditionally render depending on some dependencies, right? So if we're in editing mode, then we want this to actually show the input, right? If we're not in editing mode, we just want to show the to-do itself, the to-do message. So this is how you do a conditional render. There's several ways to do it, but we're actually going to use a ternary operator. And if you don't know what a ternary is, it's essentially, it's kind of like an inline if-else statement. It looks a bit like this. So it'll say, so we're going to run a function, right? So we say is editing. Is editing evaluating to true? If it does, then what we want is the input. Otherwise, we want the to-do.message. Okay? So we won't need this anymore. And from here, we're going to need to add some props and attributes here to our input. So let's actually clean this up a little bit so we can see what we're looking at. I like to put these on a separate line so you can kind of see what's going on a little better. And actually, we want to wrap this in a form. Now for our input, the type is text. Here we want to set a default value. To-do.message. And the reason for that is whenever we actually open this form, then we want it to go ahead and auto-populate with what we already have saved as the to-do. And we'll have our on change, remember. And we want to update to-do state. Let's put this on a new line too so we know what we're looking at. And the form, we'll put our on submit here, equals. So we want to update and reset, right? That's the idea, okay? But remember, our update and reset form, or update and reset function takes an input, the input here, and the event parameter. So remember the way to do that is we actually have to make this a callback, and then we'll call this function with the updated to do and the event. And remember now we wanted to be able to double click this, and when we double click it, actually switch it to this to create this input, right? So we'll need a function on here. Let's go ahead and we'll cut that for now. Let's make this a paragraph component, and we'll say on double click. So just like you have on click, you also have on double click as just another event. Let's do this for right now. Let's go ahead and get that in. Well, okay. And so what we want to do is actually set is editing to true, right? And if we ever want to pass a parameter through, then we have to run this as a callback. Or pass an argument through, rather. Okay, save that, and let's go here, and let's double click, and there we go. Let's see, okay, so we can edit this, and I'm not saving it yet, but we're editing it, and you see it pre-populates this with the correct input. Okay, that all looks solid. So we'll have to come back up to our index, and now we get to actually handle our update. Let's use our setter, set to-do list, okay? So now what do we want to set it to? All right, let's think for a second. How could we edit one item in an array? Remember, we're taking one item in this array, and we just want to modify that one and keep it there in its same position. So what we can actually do is use the map array method. Okay, so we see here the map method creates a new array populated with the results of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array. So this is another looping function, much like filter here. .map, we will perform this function on every single item in that array, okay? And then we'll return a new array. And we'll actually use that new array, that modified array, to set that to our state. So what we can do is actually in this set to-do list function, we can actually run a callback function in here. And so what we'll do then is run a .map within here. So we'll say to-do list .map. And for each item, we want to do some things. So if the item.id is equal to the todo.id, okay? And actually, remember, we need to pass this to do to it, so it'll have it. We need to declare to do as a parameter here, so it'll know what to do with that, okay? So same thing here. If the item that ID that we're mapping on is equal to the todo.id that we've passed through to it, then that's when we want to actually modify it, okay? So we will return, and what we want to do is we want to spread in that item, but for the message, change it to the todo.message, okay? So basically what we're doing is we're spreading in what exists and then declaring, okay, but for the message, change it to the to-do message. Okay, the one that we've sent through, change it to that. Else, just return the item. So if this is the item that we were looking for, modify it. Otherwise, just return that item and then keep moving. Okay. So we'll save that. Go back here. Get a refresh. I think it already did, but so if I double click this now and I say, oh, now I actually need to finish the tutorial videos, enter, and it's edited. You know, I like the sound of garbage better. So take out the garbage. Run the dog. Complete React portion of tutorial. Cool, there you go. So now you have your edit function. The last thing that we want to do, which I think makes for a much better experience, is whenever we submit this one, let's clear this out, right? So that's a simple fix. So let's go back to our to-do form, and on our submit function, after we've submitted, let's set the to-do. Okay, so that's basically the input on this form. Set the to-do, and we want to set it back to an initial state, right? So let's declare what that means. And, you know, it's exactly this. So then we can plug that in there. Keep our code dry. So we're only declaring this one time. We'll save that and go back here and let's say feed the cat. There we go. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of styling in here. So I'll just put this up here so you can see. You don't have to use these, but these are just it's just some very basic stuff just to make it look a little better. You know. So that concludes part one of this two-part video series. We just built a to-do app using React, and on the next series we're going to be actually building a node server where we can store all our to-dos and they'll persist, so no matter, you know, if we leave the browser, if we refresh the page, we'll still be able to come back and use our to-dos. So please join me as we build the node server in the next part of this tutorial series.